Just what I'm. So I want to first of all welcome everybody, and I'm delighted you're here. Um, so to start some background, especially for those who would not have been aware of the background to this particular presentation. Um, what happened was in the culture of the metamorphic association that Gaston St. Pierre started and created, down through the years, there always tended to be quite a lot of misunderstanding and of what this work really was about. And I mean, when I say this work, I mean much more than the practice that this person, Gaston St. Pierre, created, called the metamorphic technique. And uh, what had happened for me was I was noticing, I had attended, for example, all the international gatherings of the association. And I found that I learned a huge amount from my interactions with those gatherings, even though there was a number of them, some of them were there was presentations taking place which wasn't really in resonance with Gaston's work, but that was still even a learning experience for me. So, but what I was experiencing was, whereas I was really at the end of every gathering thrilled that I had gone to the trouble of traveling and attending, uh, I would talk to other people who, some people, not too many, who would say they didn't learn anything from it and it was a waste of time. And I'm wondering, why are they having such a different experience than I was having? So that was part of what was in my mind when I was asking myself the question before this 2009 gathering, maybe for a few years before, what's getting in the way of people understanding this work? Because I was well aware that people are intelligent. It's not that people were stupid, they are not. Um, and so then I realized something about a year before that gathering in 2009. And I realized that I wanted to make a presentation at that gathering, which would be about an hour and a half long presentation. And I picked the title I picked for that presentation was The Metamorphic Technique Does Not Exist. And I knew that title would get people's attention. So everybody at the gathering attended my presentation. So Gaston was there, and when I started into my presentation, I then clarified what I meant by that statement. And I said what I meant was that the metamorphic technique does not primarily exist. In other words, something more primary than the metamorphic technique existed. And what I proposed was that what that was were people's relationship with the metamorphic technique and their relationship with the work itself that the association was exploring. Uh, and one thing I just want to say at this point, this is a proposal of mine, which I first made in 2009. And I asked myself the other day, why has it taken so long to present it once again? But I haven't given a presentation on that presentation that I gave in 2009 until tonight. And a good way to approach what I'm proposing is, Goethe said, a good way to approach any exploration is through the use of postulates. So what's a postulate, for those of you who mightn't be aware? It's to suggest or assume the truth or existence of something as a basis for discussion. In other words, it's an exploration, it's a process to engage in. And that's in that meaning, then, it means I have no expectation that people would accept my proposal, and I had no expectation in 2009 that they would accept what I was proposing. Because if I have an expectation that you should accept what I'm proposing, that would mean that I have absolutely a complete disconnection from a real understanding of what the work is about. In other words, it would mean I was imposing my view on you, which would be a sort of a form of insanity, even though that's where the world is at the moment, mostly. So the other thing I just want to make clear is I'm speaking for myself. So because that's all I'm entitled to speak for. And when I speak for myself, then I may say things which people might assume that I'm assuming if I've done something a certain way, well, why aren't they doing something? If I acted in a certain way, I have an expectation, why aren't they acting in the same way as I acted? And that is never where I'm coming from. But where I am coming from is not that people or anybody accepts what I'm saying, but simply are prepared to consider it. So at that particular gathering, then, I presented this concept for an hour and a half. At the end of the hour and a half, I was thrilled and probably relieved as well at the time that Gaston jumped out of his chair, came up, wrapped his arms around me, told me that he had learned so many new things from my presentation that he now wanted the understanding I was presenting to be part of the overall teaching of the work he was involved in. In addition, Gaston had recorded my presentation on a tape recorder, and he said to me he wanted to put it up on the Metamorphic Association website. But when he went back to London, he discovered he had pressed the wrong button on the tape recorder and he didn't have it. Now, one of the reasons I mention that is because since I gave that presentation in 2009, a whole lot of new implications have occurred to me, which makes some of what I'm saying tonight additional and even to some degree, maybe even different than what I said at that presentation in 2009. And a couple of things anyway as well, just by way of introduction as well. This presentation is made from the platform of the Thinking Center, not from the platform which is the Gaston St. Pierre Society. The Thinking Center is something I founded 10 years ago, and I will draw your attention to the website address, which I may as well do now. I hope you can see. It's simply called thethinkingcenter.com. And the reason I'm drawing your attention to that is that if you go into the website, there's an awful lot of activity now taking place as part of the Thinking Center. And what you can then do is you can subscribe to be on the mailing list, which simply means you get information about events that are taking place. And they're for that awful coffee note. In that sense, then, Like, for example, I'm interviewing an American ambassador on the 20th of this month, and that event will be free and will be on Zoom and for people who might be interested. So there's a lot of other things happening as well. I already sent the email or the website address of the Gaston St. Pierre Society to everybody in my email. And once again, the Gaston, it's not there, it's GastonSaintPierreSociety.com, because that society is, I feel, something quite important that a number of us are already involved in. And I'm extremely grateful to be part of the group that are involved in that. So I'm watching the time as well, because I want to just confine this presentation to maybe between 30 and 40 minutes, because I don't want it to be too long. And then at least at the end of that, people might have some comments or questions, and then that allows me to maybe clarify certain things. But if you are asking any, if you want to, if you are asking any questions, if you could confine it to what I'm talking about and the different things I'm talking about tonight, rather than bringing in something outside of that, because it means then there's more of a focus retained. So often we use the word unique and uniqueness, and it's a very dramatic word. And not only is it a dramatic word, but what I'm proposing when I say it's not the metamorphic technique does not primarily exist. Buddhism does not primarily exist. I'm proposing Christianity does not primarily exist. The theory of the universal principles does not primarily exist. Judaism does not primarily exist. These are things that don't exist primarily. What does exist is our relationship with them, which doesn't mean that they don't have a real importance, but more primarily what's in existence is our relationship with them. In other words, we are viewing the outside world through our relationship with the outside world. But each of our relationships with the outside world is uniquely different. And that's a wonderful thing. You see, uniqueness is not just confined to human beings. In other words, we are individuals, and each individual may be similar to other individuals, but in some fundamental way, uniquely different. Like, for example, every snowflake is different. There's no two snowflakes the same. That's something science has already established. So the reason I'm saying that's important is because people experience the metamorphic technique or Judaism or Christianity or I'm a Republican as being primary. And as a consequence, they over-identify with something that's not primary and under-identify with something that is primary. And what is primary is one's own essence. Gaston St. Pierre talked incessantly about essence and people having an experience of their own essence. And all essence is different, you see. And the beauty of that as well is if we're sitting in a circle in a dialogue and somehow or another we're discovering that the essential gift is that we're all different, it means then that somebody in one part of the circle can see something that the rest of us can't see in where we're sitting in the circle. Also, we can see something that nobody else can see. And that's why freedom of speech is so important. And that's why when the emphasis is on that, when somehow we start to get more in resonance with what is primary is our relationship, then somehow or another, collective intelligence can manifest more easily. And because we're prepared to listen to one another and also disagree with one another, which of course is very important as well. So one other thing I just want to say, see, partly because for many, many years before I ever met Gaston St. Pierre, I'd had experiences that had me realizing to some small degree that what's happening in the world and what's happening in our consciousness is related, that we're not separate somehow. And when I met Gaston first, almost very, very early on, because I'd had these other experiences of what one might call transformation or some of the things that get in the way of it. And when I met Gaston and realized the platform he had created and what he was exploring, it was something huge, of huge importance to the wider world. In other words, I realized that this work is not just about what the practice he created, but it's about actually understanding what is taking place in the wider world, because it's related. And in that sense, then, I'd like to give you some maybe examples of why this aspect of the primary reality is our relationship is so important. Examples, I think, can be quite helpful to communicate something that might be at this point sounding a bit abstract. And an example I would give, first of all, is I was watching on YouTube an interview with this individual. He's a journalist and he's an author and he's an explorer, and he goes very often to the Amazon and he takes ayahuasca, that drug that is found in the Amazon called ayahuasca. And he was speaking about these certain discoveries he had made, and in taking ayahuasca, he was saying that he had sort of accessed another dimension. So he then said, scientists say to him, but how do you know you're not deluding yourself? And he answers the scientists by saying, well, if you yourself, he says to these scientists, if you take ayahuasca, you will know that I'm not deluding myself. So I noticed, you see, he's caught in a fundamental confusion. He's assuming that these other people's relationship with ayahuasca will be the same as his. And that's one fundamental misunderstanding, because the other people, if they did take ayahuasca, they might have a completely different experience than him, which wouldn't necessarily support that his experience is right. But for some reason, he had it upside down. He was assuming that the primary reality is ayahuasca and the shamans that he was dealing with, but that's not the primary reality. The primary reality is his relationship with that. And by the way, as well, you see, it might be that ayahuasca opens people up to other dimensions. However, the problem is that in those other dimensions, in my experience, there are forms, that there are sort of entities and beings, I feel, which are supporting our creativity, but there are other ones which aren't, which are creating a lot of illusion and self-deception in people's minds in the world. And straight away, I want to say that's not necessarily a bad thing. If we were only able to be on the right track the whole time, and we could never go off the right track onto the wrong track, we would not be free. Freedom is essential to being unique and to being human. So I'm not saying that that it's a problem when people fall into illusion and self-deception. As a matter of fact, it can be a big advantage, because if they have an insight into their illusion and self-deception, then that insight is like a light which shines on other patterns of confusion that are maybe operating at different times in their lives. So, but in any case, I'm trying to give that as an example, because, I've encountered people who have taken ayahuasca and have talked about how spiritually advanced and the spiritual experience they had. But then that removes something really important, that once the emphasis is on my relationship with something, you see, as part of my relationship, I may have insights into the reality or insights that trigger transformation, but I also have the capacity to delude myself and fall into illusion and not know it at the time. So one of Gaston St. Pierre's words so many times which links in precisely what I'm now saying, people can have the tendency to put obstacles in the way of their own transformation of certain patterns, that they're not aware that they're putting obstacles in the way. So that's a beautiful concept, because it links in with freedom. In other words, it's in the world we are in at the moment. I mean, I know, just to bring it into the world of the wider world, you see, Donald Trump was shot, as we know, and the bullet, his head moved spontaneously just at the precise second, and the bullet went through his ear. He came to the conclusion that he had been saved by God to save America. But you see, how does he know that he's not deluding himself? He might say, well, obviously, God must have arranged for some being to stop that bullet hitting him. But there are other beings that might have kept him alive in order that he can be very destructive in the future. I'm not saying one way or the other. I'm just saying that he was caught in this extraordinary rigid way of thinking, that it had to be God acting to save him, to save America and save the world as well, you see. So that brings in the realm of something that also was explored very strongly in the metamorphic association, but generally speaking, not by a certain number of people explored it and then a number didn't. And that's the difference between a belief and a fact. So a belief is not necessarily a fact, you see. So once we suddenly realize that we're in a relationship primarily with the outside world or with one another, somehow or another, being in touch with that more deeply can allow this background thing in our consciousness to not shut the door. A curiosity, I call it unconscious curiosity, is operating in the background, that we might be wrong. Now, of course, there's a danger in that as well, because there are people who say, I'm not going to act because I may be wrong the whole time. And that's an even bigger tragedy, because it's only by acting, as Plato said, by acting on what you know, will you discover whether you're right or wrong or not. So it's not a question of not acting from one's understanding. And it's certainly because otherwise, there are people, and I've heard them on television, being very humble, saying that, they know they're deluding themselves the whole time. But that's a crazy statement, because if they knew they were deluding themselves, they would no longer be deluding themselves. That's what it means. So that's an example, I suppose, of what's called false humility. Another example of what's taking place in the world. We're all aware at the moment of some of the extraordinary things that are happening, the destructiveness in certain areas, the war in Palestine and Israel, what's been happening in Gaza, what happened on the 6th of October in 2023, all of that, you see. What happened after the 6th of October 2023, when the atrocities were committed against Jewish civilians? Tony Blinken, who was Secretary of State for the US government, immediately went to Israel and joined in a discussion with the Israeli government and the War Committee or whatever as to how they were going to be responding to what Hamas had done. And he announced in that meeting to everybody that he is Jewish primarily. And you see, look at the outcome. Once he does that, once he assumes that the primary situation is his Judaism, he then is going to create blindness in himself, which his behavior of the last 16 months seemed to clearly reveal. Because then if you create this assumption that what is primary is, if I create the assumption that what is primary is I'm a Republican, not a Democrat, I automatically create a situation where I'm not able to see the problems that the Republicans are creating. If I over-identify, if I assume the primary reality is I'm Jewish or Christian, I'm not going to, when what's happening, say, for example, as far as Israel is concerned, I'm not going to be able to see the level of the atrocity. Somehow or another, I'll be neutered from seeing that, which means I won't be able to respond to it in whatever way. And response might mean just having the ability to really see the level of the atrocity, or maybe write to the Israeli embassy, which is what I did here in Ireland. I'm not saying other people should do that. I'm just saying I felt the impulse to do that, and I did, and I've had interaction with the Israeli ambassador, which has proven very helpful. But the other thing too is just another example, because I am watching the time. Yeah, we have some time left, and then I can talk. See, when I was addressing the situation with what had happened in the Metamorphic Association, I suddenly realized one of the reasons people could not properly read the emails I was writing was, I felt some people, they were assuming that my response to what was happening would have been the same as what their response would have been. In other words, if they had been kicked out or abused in whatever way it happened, they would have felt hurt. So they assumed I was feeling hurt, which therefore meant I was feeling the need for revenge, but I was feeling neither of those things. I was feeling enormous concern for the importance of protecting the work of Gaston St. Pierre and our work, the other people that are involved, and the association, because it has relevance to the wider world and the conflicts that are taking place and the enormous unnecessary suffering that's going on. But because and I'll give you an example. One person decided to leave the work of the association, for example, and in some cases, what I didn't want to get involved with me any further, and even with regard to the Gaston St. Pierre Society, because they felt it was a battle that was taking place between myself and, for example, the trustees. No, I'm not against a battle, by the way. There's times to battle as well. But it wasn't a battle. I was simply confronting all the time what needed to be confronted. And I was doing that also on behalf of the members, so as they themselves then could see or even find out what had really taken place, so as they could maybe help then protect the integrity of this association that Gaston St. Pierre had created. So the person, you see, is assuming what's primary for them is what I'm doing, but it's not. What's primary is their relationship in what I'm doing, and within their relationship with what I'm doing is a number of misunderstandings that exist within their relationship. So in a sense then, you see, it's not, and I just quickly maybe get a bit more scientific. You see, in studies on vision, which go back such maybe 100 years, it was discovered that when we are now looking at one another, we are assuming we are actually factually, what's primary is what we're seeing out there. In other words, I'm seeing you, you're seeing me. And that the reason we're seeing each other because we exist outside of each other, and that's what we're seeing. But studies on vision then suddenly realize that no, that's not what's happening. Apparently, photons of light is hitting our visual cortex. It's then being sent to the brain, our brains, and our brains are creating the image of what's outside. Now that's an extraordinary thing, but it also supports what I'm saying, that what is primary is our relationship. And there was this thing then in philosophy and in science. There was this Bishop Berkeley who came to the conclusion that there was nothing outside of us. It was all, and we're creating an imagination that was put in our minds by God. That's what his theory was, which had quite an influence on the study of psychology at the time and the study of consciousness. And then Immanuel Kant came along, the famous German philosopher, and he said, no, there is something existing outside of us. And that something, however, we cannot know, but it actually does exist. So he had a different view. So when I came back from university in San Francisco in 1990, I was creating and presenting a lot of different classes and seminars at different colleges in Ireland. And I was creating, they all would be, sometimes there might have even been a metamorphic technique class. Another time, it might be a class on the psychology of peace and war. These were classes I was creating myself and giving in these colleges. And I had this very strong tendency, because I had begun to realize while I lived in California, oh my God, we're not in contact with reality. We're in contact with our perception of reality. And I was saying this often at my classes. And then something happened. which liberated me. And it's this. I don't know if you can see that painting. I'm hoping you can maybe see it. Around about that time when I came back from California, probably about 2 years afterwards, and I'm giving all these seminars and classes and whatnot, and saying this, that we are not in contact with our reality, we're contacted with a perception of reality, because I'm trying to modify people's, especially those who have quite rigid views, especially if they're a bit fanatical. My wife gave me that painting. I took one look at it. It's by a painter in the town I lived in at the time called Clare Power. Spontaneously, I suddenly realized, yes, just because we are primarily in contact with our perception of reality rather than reality does not mean that that perception does not have the seeds of being in contact with the outside reality directly. It totally changed. It was completely spontaneously. It totally changed my view. So my view is different than Immanuel Kant, and it's different than Bishop Berkeley. And it's the view I was presenting at that presentation in 2009 at the gathering. In other words, we are not disconnected from what's outside. Consequently, that's why it's so important we exercise our God-given right to share what we understand, to share what we're seeing through our responsibility. And it is a God-given right. And it's only by doing that then that it can lead to the expansion of what we already understand, or it can lead to the discovery of something that we might be mistaken on. So I think that's one of the final examples I want to mention. There is one other I may come to. So another thing, just want to also say, you see, one of the things that really also gets in the way of transformation, and it was very prevalent, for some reason it got into the culture of the association and this work, and quite a lot of people got tangled up in it and still are. The avoidance of conflict. You see, this avoidance of conflict is really a huge problem, because it is often through engaging with conflict that conflict can transform itself and our understanding of it. I'm not saying that we should go around looking for conflict. No, what I'm saying is when conflict arrives into our environment, we shouldn't have, sometimes it's right to avoid it, but we shouldn't have this pseudo spiritual notion that it's not spiritual to be involved in conflict. The statement of Jesus, I think, is probably one of the most profound, because people talk about bringing peace to the world, but what he said apparently was, I have not come to bring peace to the world, but I bring a sword. In other words, because if we avoid conflict, and that's to a large extent, I feel, what happened a lot of the people in the association when these extraordinary events of the last 3 years occurred, they didn't get involved, they didn't exercise their responsibility because they were caught in some false notion that it was important to avoid any conflict that was taking place with other people, which meant me and the trustees. And consequently, to this day, a lot of them are not aware of how conflict gets in, avoidance of it gets in the way of the transformation of our understanding. So in any case, that is all I really want to say about this subject, or sort of end this presentation, but I am interested in, should anybody have a, go ahead and look at the time and so, yeah, it was 40 minutes. If anybody would like to say something or ask anything or while maybe somebody, while you're just pondering and maybe considering what you might like to say or not say, here's an example of the link between this work and the outside world. You see, I wrote that there is this professor, Jeffrey Roberts, who I interviewed 2 years ago on the Thinking Center, and I will be interviewing again soon. And he had gone to the embassy, the Russian embassy in London, because he's an expert on Russian history, and he's written many books about Russian history. And when he did that, you see, in my experience, there's an extraordinarily lopsided narrative about what's taken place in Ukraine. It's not that I'm in agreement with Putin or would want to be in agreement, no, except that the Western world has fallen into a totally lopsided version of events, and there is tremendous censorship. So what actually happened was, when Jeffrey Roberts went to the embassy, because he is Professor Emeritus from University College Cork in Ireland, and this member of the European Parliament, every country in Europe who are members, they'll have a number of MPs who have European Parliament membership. And this particular Irish person attacked what Jeffrey Roberts had done. And not only that, but he contacted Ireland's most popular newspaper, and they wrote an article a week ago where he's condemning what Jeffrey Roberts had done, and that he's betraying what's going on in Ukraine, and almost implying that Jeffrey is a Putin apologist. So I decided to write to the newspaper, which I did, and they published what I wrote. And I just want to quickly read it out to you, because it will give you what is a direct link between the conflict taking place in the world and what's happening in the outside world, and what Gaston St. Pierre and his creation of the association was exploring, and what we're exploring or trying to explore. So what I wrote was, here in the 32 counties of Ireland, our recent history has surely taught us the crucial importance of dialogue and communication. It has been discovered that when dialogue and direct communication is avoided, an absence of open communication leads people to make assumptions about each other or about situations that they only hear about secondhand, which may or may not be correct. People may then continue to view each other through these assumptions, which gives further weight to the inaccuracy or incompleteness of these assumptions to begin with. And I went on to say that I'm asking the question then, if in Ireland, where we acknowledge dialogue has been so important in resolving the conflicts that occurred in the north of Ireland, I'm asking this politician, did he have a conversation with Jeffrey Roberts before he came to his conclusions about Jeffrey? Of course, he didn't, you see. So it's not that I want to criticize that member of European Parliament. It's just that people are not aware of the implications of these things. And that's one of the reasons I fight so hard to protect the integrity of what this extraordinary person called Gaston unleashed into the world. Because if the integrity of what he's done is destroyed, then the seeds that are created in that integrity cannot sprout, and therefore we won't ever get the opportunity, or we wouldn't get the opportunity to share with others that are not involved in our area, whether they're ambassadors or politicians or whatever, what we are discovering. You see, that's my primary passion, is as far as this work is concerned, because it is really disturbing, I experience anyway, the incredible unnecessary suffering that's been created in the world by so much stupidity. And just because I was interviewed this morning on a radio station in Ireland, and I explained something about just because people are heads of governments, it doesn't mean they're not noticing implications that are very damaging. They're just not noticing it. And people are assuming because they're a head of a government that they are noticing, but they're not necessarily noticing. So this is why conversation or dialogue between us can allow me to notice implications I haven't yet noticed about something maybe misunderstanding in myself. So basically, I just wanted to share that as the direct link between the work we're involved in and what's happening in the world at large. So I'm just wondering if anybody has anything they'd like to say or not. We can, if not, that's fine. We can then bring the meeting to a close, or the presentation to a close. And I'm really, really grateful for your attendance. And I've mentioned the Thinking Centre already. So if people that are here, we're engaging with for the first time, there are some people here, which is great, want to contact the website of the Thinking Centre, then at least we will be in conversation again sometime in the future. So thank you very much for your attendance, and sleep well. So I have to stop the recording.
Thank you, Eddie.
Yes, we have to thank also to hear you, Eddie. Thank you very much. And I'm glad to see all the others. And hope we see again.
That's that's brilliant, Monica and Marianne. I really appreciate that. And I'm now trying to figure out how do I end stop. Oh, no. Stop the recording. Let's see. I can slice this off the end of the recording anyway. Marianne, can you remind me, how do I stop the recording?
I think it ends if we go out.
If you want to end it, where did you push the button recording? It must be the same place or somewhere.
Oh yeah, sorry. I think I now. Sorry for my incompetence. So where did I press that button? Is where you see this. I think they're after changing things on the. I downloaded a new version, which I had to do to get into the meeting actually on Zoom, and they seem to have changed certain things. Now
That's what I do all the time.
Oh wait, no, I think I have it. Have I?